So just right before we start and roll the intro song, I just have a question to ask. Why is it so hard to find Gustavo Kuerten's matches online? I mean, I'm willing to pay for that. Why is it so hard to find those things? He's a 3-time Grand Slam champion and year-end number 1 in 2000, man. Come on. Okay, now we can roll the intro song. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to Tennis and Bagels, the podcast about everything tennis. And this is your host, Andre. And today I am going to talk about a player that is very special to me. I'm a big fan. And, well, I guess you could say that I'm a big fan because I'm Brazilian as well. Because, this guy is one of the greatest players of the Open era. And he's a 3-time Grand Slam champion, and he does really fit well with the current situation and the current weeks, because at this point we were supposed to be watching Roland Garros, but because of the whole crisis and the quarantine and lockdown measures, you figure it out, we're still not having tennis, we're still not having professional tennis. Players can not really just travel from place to place, and we don't have crowds, so there's no Roland Garros. Most people are doing reliving matches and stuff, but I want to relive one certain person, and his name is, as you heard in the pre-intro rant, Gustavo Kuerten, and he is a former world number 1 in 2000 and 2001. He stayed there for 43 weeks and 3 times Roland Garros champion. And just to start a little bit with some context, like who is Gustavo Kuerten? Well, obviously, you know, he was a tennis player. He was a professional tennis player. And he is from Brazil, my home country. That's where I was born. That's where I lived for the first 16 years of my life before I moved to Montreal. But he's from a city that is a little bit farther away from me. He's from Florianopolis. And you know, Brazil doesn't necessarily have like the best tennis players in the world. Like right now, we kind of have like some good doubles players and whatnot. And I've mentioned in my podcast about the history of Wimbledon, a woman named Maria Bueno. She was a 3-time Wimbledon champion and 4-time US Open champion. But Kuerten has something just a little special about him that it's not that easy to explain. He just kind of like is essentially, when everybody is describing him, just say like how Kuerten was just so nice and so relaxed on court, and he was just very smiling all the time. And yeah, I guess that's his personality is a big part of why essentially he was so great, and how he's so remembered, and why he ended up being so important in tennis history and in Roland Garros. And he actually does have some pretty impressive records. In his rather short career, he retired officially in 2008, but he hasn't really been playing that much for the past 2 seasons. So his actual career really kind of spanned from 1995 to 2004, which is 10 years, but he wasn't really relevant until 1997, from 2002, 2003. So that's kind of like... his span was short because of injuries that he had suffered in his hip, and I believe his elbow as well, which is a little sad. Maybe he could have achieved more if it wasn't for that. But just to start off, I mentioned how he was in world number 1 and 3 times major champion. He won Roland Garros in 1997, 2000, and 2001. The last one that he won, he was actually seeded world number 1, and yeah, it was pretty impressive. Like, all of his runs at Roland Garros were all really interesting and full of drama. And for quite some time, he was actually kind of like known as the king of clay, right? So he came after past kings of clay came in, such as Thomas Muster, and there was also Sergi Bruguera, who won the Roland Garros title twice. And Kuerten had won, I believe, all of the Masters titles that you could win on clay, at the time being Monte Carlo, Rome, and Hamburg. And he won, obviously, the Roland Garros title, but he also won the Cincinnati Masters 1000 well, I don't remember exactly when. I believe it was 2000 or 2001. Well, I can't really recall, but it was one of those in the span of the years that he was playing his best tennis. He was also the only man to beat Agassi and Sampras in the same tournament. He beat them back-to-back in the semifinals and the finals at the Masters Cup in 2000, and this entire tournament essentially defined a lot of his career because at that time he was running the rankings race against, I believe, Marat Safin, and he needed to win the tournament to finish as the world number one. Otherwise, Safin would become the number one. And he did so, and he had to overcome the massive task of beating Sampras and Agassi. And obviously, they were not at the prime of their careers. I believe especially Sampras was kind of seeing the steady decline, and he was not necessarily the best player of the world, but he was still Pete Sampras. He still won at that year in 2000 the Wimbledon Championships, and he went on to win the US Open title in 2002. So he was still a pretty big player. And also Andre Agassi has been very important in the 2000s as well, and he won the Roland Garros title in 1999, and he won a couple more of Grand Slams in the 2000s as well. So he wasn't just like a pushover. Obviously, like just by seeing who was the tournament, the Masters Cup it's the year-end tournament. Like now we call them World Tour Finals, the ATP Finals, and it's only the best 8 players in the world that qualify. So being Sampras and Agassi in the top 8 players of the world is kind of proof enough that it was still not an easy task, you know. So there's a lot of things to unpack about Guga, and besides the fact that there's a lack of full matches, and I believe not that many highlights online, even though if you dig, you can find a few things here and there. A lot of them have terrible quality because it was the 90s, and I think it's just mostly people who ended up recording on their VHS tapes at home for matches that they watched of him, and they just kind of ended up uploading them to YouTube, which is I'm grateful for. I'm thankful for those people who did that, because that's the only way that you can watch. But yeah, I was trying to watch a Thomas Muster Gustavo Kuerten match. It was the round 3 of Roland Garros 1997, went up to 5 sets. It was a really interesting match. The quality of the video was really tough to watch. It made it really hard to watch it, because at some points I could just barely see the ball. Like I got glimpses of like the trace on the screen, because the pixels kind of like moved a little bit and changed the color, but it was overall very tough. But I could get a big sense of Gustavo Kuerten playing, especially at that tournament. It was his first title ever, if I'm not mistaken. It was the Grand Slam, was a Roland Garros. That was his 3rd attempt at, I want to say, at a Grand Slam championship. Like, he took only 3 times. So he played 2 Grand Slams prior to winning his first Grand Slams. I believe that's the case. If not, he played Roland Garros 3 times, and on the 3rd time he won it. But I really was happy to watch that match and watch a few more highlights and whatnot, even though they were very short clips of like maybe 5 minutes. But I really enjoyed watching him and seeing his playing style. And there was obviously like some differences between how tennis is today from how tennis used to be in the 90s. And although a lot of things remain, obviously it hasn't changed all that much, but it was interesting to see just kind of like the players, and every time like you were on court, well, not you were on court, but like you looked at the draw and you would see so many big names, I feel like it's interesting nowadays when you look at the big 3, and you just kind of like I believe ever since Federer came up and Nadal in 2005, we just kind of have been overlooking a lot of players, and they just remain in the shadows of those three players just because they've been so dominant. But especially in the 90s and early 2000s, there were so many great players. They were fantastically good, and I don't think that players are bad. I don't think they were bad like in the first span, like maybe 2005 to 2000 and I don't know 13. I just think that it's just the Nadal, Federer, and Djokovic were just so good that made other players uncomfortable, and they just kind of like walked in defeated most of the time. But there are some interesting records, but that's a talk for another episode, like how was it really a weak era, the 2000s? And I honestly don't think so, and I think Guga is a really great example of that. And by the way, I'm going to be referring to him interchangeably as Guga or Kuerten. Kuerten is his last name, and Guga is how he's known in Brazil and in a lot of places of the world. It's kind of like his nickname. His playing styles is interesting to see, because as a clay courter, you know that you can guess that he was a baseliner. He has a really powerful ground strokes, and he moves well. Well, he used to move well. And he had lots of topspin, and he had a lot of patience, and he used to build his points really well. But I think it's very interesting to see, like, so many clay court specialists, they really stay very, very far back on the court, and they like to return really far away. Nadal is a good example of that, although he really does mix it up a bit. But Guga had something a little bit different to him, is that he was almost always attacking. Like, he was not necessarily he always like was dictating point from the get-go, and his serve is not very talked about, even though like the first thing that I noticed when I started watching his matches is kind of like, wow, he really hits a lot of aces, and he really sets up the point really well with his serve. It's like a really big serve. He doesn't have, that was never a weakness in his game. I actually couldn't really find much of a weakness in his game per se, because his forehand was incredibly solid. Had a lot of spin. He could hit it hard. He could hit it with the angles, and he could set up the points really well. His inside out forehand was particularly fantastic, in my opinion. Like, you could reach incredible angles with that, and his backhand, there's absolutely no question about it being one of the best backhands, I guess ever, maybe on clay at least. And it's interesting to see, because as a king of clay, even though it's in the 90s, a little older, like nowadays most people play with a single-handed backhand. We're seeing like a little bit of a renaissance of the one-handed with Dominic Thiem and what's his name? Oh my gosh, Tsitsipas. And but Gustavo Kuerten had a backhand that was one-handed, and it was not vulnerable. It was just not a weakness. It was, in fact, probably his strongest wing, even though obviously he would run around his forehand and probably would prefer that shot in terms of like how comfortable and how harder he could hit it. But his backhand down the line was phenomenal. Like, I would watch the match and the highlights, and there's always backhand down the line winners. He took the ball so early, and he hit it with so much power, and you cannot. I just keep imagining how he would play against Nadal if they had a chance to play against each other in their primes, because he would take that ball really early and just place it really deep on court, and it's I don't know, it was just really fantastic how he managed to control that shot. I couldn't really see the Nadal topspin really bothering him all that much. Obviously, it would be a tougher shot to play because Nadal's spin makes the ball jump also really fast and really high, and it's kind of hard to control. But I think Guga would have a chance of using that spin in his favor to like maybe bring in some angles, and also if he got used to the bounce, he probably would have been able to handle that a little bit better and really fire into his backhand on the down the line. So that would have been really interesting. If we could have had a chance to see that, it would have been an interesting match to experience. Unfortunately, it's just kind of like assuming and speculating what would happen, because that would obviously never happen. So the closest thing that I can think about Kuerten is Dominic Thiem, in the sense that like he has really powerful strokes, really intense playing style. But I think Gustavo Kuerten is kind of like a little bit of a Dominic Thiem mixes up with Roger Federer, except like he's obviously pushing a little bit more towards Thiem. But Kuerten never really failed as well in the touch, and his touch was always intense. If you watch the Thomas Muster match as well, and all other matches as well, like you're going to see that he has a really decent drop shot, and he just knows what to do when he's inside the court. Like when he is in an attacking position, he's not just kind of, what am I doing here? Like he goes to the net often, and he wins lots of points at the net. And that's the virtue of like him being patient and setting up the point well, and just kind of like when he sees an opportunity, he just goes for it. And that probably helped him a lot, like in winning his first 1997 title. Another thing that is quite particular of Guga's game is the fact that he just looks like so relaxed, and he was a skinny dude, right? He doesn't look very like athletic, and he just kind of like tall and skinny, like long arms and whatnot. Just kind of like his backhand and forehand kind of like look like the racket is like too big for his hands and whatnot. But he had so much power. He just seemed so relaxed on court that you just really couldn't tell like what shot he was going to play. We couldn't really tell if he was going to hit hard, or if he was going to hit with topspin, he was going to hit on the backhand with a drop shot or a slice, which he didn't really use that much, or he was going to hit like the topspin backhand. So yeah, it's just surprising to me, I guess, that he couldn't really just adapt very, very well to other surfaces. Although I did mention that he did win some good titles on hard courts as well. But it seems to me like Guga could have made a pretty big grass court player. Like I feel like he would have had the chance if he adopted a little bit more of the serve and volley style, because his volleys were good, his serve was good. There was really no reason why he wouldn't do it. But maybe his ground strokes over there a little too long, I guess. Like his motion was too long, and it's probably hit with like way too much spin. So maybe the clay court bounce and slower conditions helped him set up his shots better, which is probably one of the reasons. If you got a chance to see any interviews or ask him personally whether that was the reason, maybe you'd see it. But like I think he could have made like a really good grass court player. So yeah, that's it. And Roland Garros 1997, since that's kind of like one of the things that I really wanted to talk about in this podcast. For one, because it's Roland Garros week, even though we're not having Roland Garros, it's just kind of like remembering what could have been without crisis and lockdowns. But 1997 was as well the Roland Garros tournament where Guga was born. Like it was a very important tournament in his career. Well, not just the fact that it was a Grand Slam that he won and it being his first title, but because he was also ranked number 66, he was not really having a good season at that time. He was just not supposed to win at that tournament, honestly. Like if you look at the draw and who he beat and who was there, although a lot of players, the top players really did go out early in the tournament, some of them actually came in, they went down because of Guga. So it's just 1997 is legendary. It's not a normal thing that would happen. It's kind of like the only fair comparison would be to Goran Ivanisevic, who won Wimbledon in 2001, although Ivanisevic had already been a top player, so it's not like he would have been completely out of the game. It's just kind of winning a tournament that big without actually that much experience and that much renown. It's pretty impressive to look at that achievement alone. And the fact that he came back and won twice really just shows that not only that he grew into his game, but he also had the confidence to believe that that wasn't just a lucky 2 weeks. He achieved it. He achieved more. The Grand Slam just opened up all of the doors to his career to like flourish and become who he ended up becoming. The 90s is a very intense decade. Sometimes we can think of players, when I think of them, I would imagine that they're mostly important in one decade only, right? Even though Federer and Nadal and Djokovic are kind of like pushing the limits of that. But you think of them like if you're good in the 80s, by the end of the 90s, you're kind of like in the twilight of your career, right? But those guys that he was facing, they were not necessarily old and they weren't playing badly. Like, they were still incredibly dangerous. So I think Roland Garros really shows why the 90s were very interesting. I'm just gonna pull out the list of winners here because I think it's really interesting to see like the 90s who won. Like from 1990 to 1999, the winners were, I think, Alex Gomez. I have to check his full name. Andres Gomez from Ecuador in 1990. Then Jim Courier won it back-to-back in 1991, 1992. Jim Courier was a former world number one. Very good player. Then Sergi Bruguera from Spain, 1993, 1994, whom Guga actually beat in the final of 1997. And then Thomas Muster came and won in 1995. Evgeny Kafelnikov won in 1996. Then Guga won 1997, and Moya in 1998. Agassi in 1999. So lots of winners and just one decade. A couple 2-time winners, but big names. Thomas Muster was an incredible player. He won so many big titles in his life. He was super dominant on clay. It was he won most of his titles on clay. At some seasons, he essentially swept all of the slams. I believe his best season was 1996 in terms of number of titles won. Although he did not win a Grand Slam in that time. He actually, in fact, only won Roland Garros once, and that was the only Grand Slam he's ever won. But he was a fantastic player. And one of the reasons why it's important to look at those guys is because Guga actually defeated 3 of them in that one tournament. He beat Muster, Kafelnikov, and Sergi Bruguera in that same tournament. He beat Muster, Medvedev, and Kafelnikov. Medvedev being, I think, a former world number 4. He never won a Grand Slam, although he reached the final twice. One in the Australian Open and the other one in Roland Garros. Wimbledon, I want to say. Well, anyways, I think he reached the Roland Garros final. No, actually, never mind. I think he only reached the final in the Australian Open, but that's it. He did beat Muster, Medvedev, and Kafelnikov in 3 5-set thrillers. And the big win against Muster is the one that I've watched to completion. It was an interesting match to see because it just didn't seem like Guga was playing his ranking. He was dominating play. He never really seemed like to be the guy who was going to be beaten. Although he did face a really, really hard time in the 5th set, and he actually ended up becoming kind of like known as a marathon man in Roland Garros. He won a bunch of 5-setters, and in a few of those, he was actually down in some of the sets, so he was not really exactly doing perfectly well. I have in front of me, they made an article about Guga on Roland Garros, which I'm going to leave in the description of this podcast and on my Facebook page and on my Instagram, which you can follow at Tennis and Bagels, and just Tennis and Bagels on Facebook. You can find me really easily. So that comes it. Like here's exactly how as it says in the article. Kuerten, the comeback king. The toughest part of playing Guga was finish him off. as the players below can attest to, Thomas Muster, the match that I've been talking to the third round in 1997, he was a point away from a 3-love lead in the fifth set, which, by the way, has an interesting story there that I want to talk to you about later. Andrei Medvedev, he beat like the fourth round of 1997. So right after Muster, Medvedev led 2-1 with a break in the fifth set, and then was up love 40 or maybe 40 love on Guga's serve at 4-all. So he had everything to beat him. And then Kafelnikov, the defending champion from 1996, he led by 2-1 and 4-2 in the first set. So Guga went off. He almost didn't even make a fifth set in that one. And then Juan Carlos Ferrero, now in actually the one that I mentioned was in 2000, that he almost lost to Kafelnikov, but he also beat Kafelnikov in the quarterfinals in 1997. And then also in 2000 in the semifinals, right after beating Kafelnikov, he came down from 2-1 and 3-1 in the fourth set. That's the hole that Guga was in. And you can see some of the highlights of those matches. Ferrero was playing really, really well and pushing Guga really in the back of the court. He was kind of playing an attacking game that was somewhat similar to Guga's, and he was defending incredibly well too. Michael Russell, like probably one of the most iconic matches that Kuerten played. Russell led by 2-love, 5-3 in the third, and held a match point on his serve. That itself, like when I watched the highlights for this and I watched that point, it still gives me the goosebumps. I still feel like Guga is gonna miss that, because at that match point he hit a forehand not so well. It was a very windy day, and Kuerten hit a forehand down the line. Not necessarily an attacking shot, but the ball landed on the line. It landed on the baseline. That is kind of when I watched that, like my heart just kind of like goes up. My heart rate goes up a bit, because I'm like, it could go out, but it didn't. Even though it's a video and I know he won that match and he went off to win the tournament, it still feels impressive. Then he beat David Saginetti in the second round of 2002, and he led by 2-1, and he was 2-love up in the fourth round with love 40 on return. And he also beat Nicolas Almagro in the first round of 2004. He served, and Almagro served for the match at 5-4 in the fifth set. So also 2004 is the year that 2002 and 2004 is already kind of like the years where Guga was not really playing at his best, and he is suffering with the hip injuries, and it was essentially it for it. Like it's a sad, it was a sad ending of his career, and that's why I really kind of like I don't want to touch too much on that. I don't want to really talk about his injuries as much as I want to talk about how great he was for the sport. And in 2004, one of the things that he did was, I really like looking at that stat, because he beat Roger Federer in the fourth round of a Grand Slam. And that was the first time that Roger lost in the first round of a Grand Slam, in the first week of a Grand Slam, until I believe 2012 or 13. So Federer, that was the only loss that Federer got in the first week of a Grand Slam in a long time, and that was also the only loss at a Grand Slam that Roger suffered in that year. In 2004, from 2004 and 2004, I believe 2004, 2006, and 2007, Federer won 3 Grand Slams. So yeah, maybe if Guga didn't defeat him in that round, maybe he would have won to win his first Roland Garros title, and could have possibly have completed the Grand Slam year right then. Like, I feel like Federer was that dominant, but just Guga just really showed a lot of resilience, and also a lot of why he was a great champion on clay. And in his interviews that he gave in the article that I'm going to leave in the description, he was talking about how he faced off Roger Federer, and he was already not at his best, and he was kind of like thinking in the lines of, well, you're big, you're the guy right now, you're the one to beat, but this is my home, this is like my turf, or like my dirt in that sense. So it's cool to see how he just kind of like finessed Federer and won that match, because Federer was never really a great clay court player, although he is very decent. He if it weren't for Nadal, maybe he would have had like maybe 5 Roland Garros titles as well. But he did get a clinic by Guga. He got served entirely in that match, and straight set 6-4, 6-4, 6-4. It really doesn't show that. It really shows that Kuerten, it wasn't just luck. He didn't really just kind of like push through. He really just dominated in that match when it really mattered. Another cool fact I find for Gustavo Kuerten and his story, especially with Kafelnikov, is that Guga beat Kafelnikov in all of his title runs at Roland Garros in the quarterfinals. At the same stage, he beat Kafelnikov in the quarterfinals. 2 of them were 5-set matches. The first one in 1997 and the second one in 2000, where he had to come down from very poor position. And in the last one in 2001, he won in 4 sets. And Kafelnikov was the one that actually gave Guga like a less known nickname, like the Picasso of clay or whatever, the Tennis Picasso or something like this. Because to be honest, like some sort of shots that Guga played, and he also plays different than Nadal, and that's kind of like why I associate him with Federer as well, because Nadal is he does hit like paintings of a shot in a sense. Nadal has incredible shots to his CV. You can find out pretty much all of them online. But Nadal is more known as a power player. He is very physical. He runs, and his shots seem to require a lot of effort to make. And the fact that he does that day in, day out, and it's a feat in itself. And his arms are really big. Nadal's a big guy. So Guga wasn't like that. He was just kind of like relaxed and just kind of like more flow motion, just like kind of like in a sense like Roger Federer, but a bit less perfect. Guga was more like a relaxed type of thing. It's kind of like the cool guy. He like walks and has a lot of swag and just kind of like hits the ball very, very relaxed, and doesn't really seem to be getting tired of doing this. Doesn't really seem to be an effort heavy shot that he hits either wing or anything. But he still just like paints the line and hits incredible passing shots and volleys and forehands down the line, forehand angles. Really, there was nothing really lacking on his game. It's fantastic to watch, and I found a bit more links online of matches on YouTube that I am going to watch even after this. I really wanted to have watched all of them before doing this, so I could kind of like comment a little bit on those matches. But it would have been this podcast would have been like 6 hours long if I were to comment on every single match that he played that was fantastic, which were many. And as I mentioned, Guga also beat Bruguera. I think it's Bruguera, not Bruguera. I don't know exactly how to pronounce him. He was from Spain. And he beat him in the final of 1997. And I guess it would have been more likely that he would have to be pushed in that particular match in the final. But he actually entered the match almost as the favorite. I guess he's obviously the underdog because it's a first-time Grand Slam finalist. He played a couple 5-set matches that were really grueling, physical. So kind of like he spent a lot of time on the court. So probably Bruguera was a favorite because of his experience and because of his run to the final as well. Even though he was like number 16 seed, he was already a 2-time Grand Slam champion. So, and on Roland Garros, so that's very important. But Guga actually beat him very comprehensively in 3 straight sets, and I believe the scoreline was 6-3, 6-4, 6-2. So, very impressive feat by him. Just kind of like he just never seemed intimidated by who was at the other side of the net. He always kind of like played to his best and played in his head and kind of like try to get himself in the zone. And he ended up taking the title. And yeah, that's honestly like one of the matches that I actually want to watch, because when you watch some of the interviews and whatnot, I watched the one that was in Portuguese, which was really cool to watch, because it means that they actually speaking perfectly what they think and what they want to say. So it's nice to be able to understand him on that level. So he was saying like how that match was essentially perfect. He played that match, and if he looks at it back like in hindsight, if he looks at it nowadays, you would see it, and he would just probably he saw it that there was essentially no technical errors from his part. He was so in the zone, he was so confident in himself that essentially there was no stopping him at that point. Like, and that's one of the things that he said, like after he beat, I believe, Medvedev or Kafelnikov, one of the two, and once he finished those matches, he was like, now I feel like nobody can stop me. Like, this is mine for the taking. And I'm gonna contrast this now with the his expectations coming into this tournament. As I mentioned, he didn't really have a great career at that point. He was just kind of like ranked number 66. He didn't really win much, and he wasn't necessarily in the picture. But what ended up happening was that he was running totally out of confidence. That's by his words. Like, his confidence evaporated, as he was saying. And he was traveling around the world and just couldn't really get anything going. He would play a good game here and then lose the other one really badly. So he just couldn't really have the fun of the playing anymore. And that is in 1987. So he went back home in Florianopolis. And that's kind of like a big part of his personality and his game too, because he's very attached to Brazil, very attached to Florianopolis. And that actually helped him regroup and recharge his batteries, as per the words of his older brother. Because he ended up coming back home and he played a couple tough matches in the Challenger and won the Challenger, and then decided to go to Paris. And I don't remember where I read that interview, where he said, I was confident in Roland Garros, but I just kind of like wanted to get my feet wet, right? I just wanted to try to make get a couple wins and see how it goes and see how I feel. And he was expecting no more than like a third round showing, probably because his third round showing was against Thomas Muster. And his confidence just rose. It was just kind of like a magical. It's kind of like got that champion thing in that was born in him. It was not necessarily the confidence to win, but the confidence to know that he can win any match, which is very, very important to people, to players rather, because you see so many times like a player just kind of like comes in and causes an upset. Like you can remember a few from Federer and Nadal, and they just kind of prepare for that match, and they have that match, and they kind of like go in, if I win this match, this is my career. But and not to say that it's bad to think in that way in a lot of senses, because sometimes you just know who you are and who they are and what you're capable of. And it's good to respect players. But Guga just had that kind of like the clicking thing in his mind that allowed him to push himself to the next level and know that he is capable of, and believe that he's capable of winning and playing great shots against the greatest players on the planet. And that really showed against Muster. First set was not like a walk in the park at all. It was a 7-6 win in the favor of Thomas Muster in the first set. But Guga really played incredibly well. It was really tight, and then Guga proceeded to have a 6-1, 6-3 in the following sets. So he dominated those two sets, and things got a little bit more complicated. And this really just goes to show how his confidence rose to the occasion. And in terms of that confidence, there was one thing that I saw that kind of like puzzled me a little bit in the documentary that they made for Roland Garros. I think it's in the Roland Garros YouTube channel. So it's named O Guga. O means it means in Portuguese the Guga, right? So that's kind of like how people refer to him, because in Brazil, in several regions of the country, you use the article to, is that how you say it? But anyway, to refer to like before names. So like my name is Andre, I'll be the Andre, right? So that's kind of a thing that happens back there. But anyways, that's just to give you a little bit of like linguistics information. But back to the match. In the final set, as I mentioned, Guga was almost down to three love down, right, to Muster, and that would have meant that he would probably go on to lose the match. He was already a breakdown. He could have been double breakdown, and apparently, as he says, I don't know if his brother said that or he said it, but like his brother shouted from the stands, probably his player box, which is near the court. Hey, what you doing? And they were playing at Suzanne Langlan. It was a smaller court than Philippe Chatrier. Like, what are you doing? You're in Paris. You're here to win. Like, have some confidence. Like, put yourself together. You came all this way. You cannot just like give up now. And the thing about it is that I don't know much of officiating. Like I did take an officiating class at Tennis Quebec, which is the officiating governing body in Quebec. It doesn't govern the Masters 1000 tournament in Montreal, but is involved in everything else. So and they do formations for lines judge and umpire and coaches as well. So I do know about the rules, and I do know about the blurred lines and more the gray areas, and that for me is a gray area. That help that his brother gave him is for me what I would consider a gray area in terms of the rule of coaching, because if I'm not mistaken, I'm just kind of paraphrasing, I might be missing something, but like coaching is essentially anything that can make a player go from A to B. So if you can change the player's behavior on court, it's considered coaching. So if you're just kind of like cheering, just kind of like, come on, or like you can do this, kind of like just shouts like this, like let's go, it's celebrating, it's kind of like pumping up, it's not considered coaching, because if you were, people would just kind of be robots on court. Maybe coaches wouldn't even be allowed to be on court, which would be ridiculous. But that, it's kind of like a blurred line. I feel like it could be considered, depending on the entire umpire, it could be considered coaching. And although this wouldn't necessarily have changed the outcome of the match, after all, it could have changed something because it's just like you just get a warning. You don't lose a point, you don't get disqualified unless you get a number of those. So, but it could have changed how Guga received that. So, and the reason why I think this is important to mention is because, well, Guga spoke in Portuguese to his family, which is obvious. I speak in Portuguese to my family. The umpires, they're required to speak only the languages, at least say the score line in France. I don't know everywhere else, but in France, they say a lot of the stuff in French. And you can see by their accents that most of them just kind of like probably know that basics that they need to know to give people in the stands the orders to be like, hey, please silence, please sit down, and ready play, 30-40, and stuff like that. But he couldn't have possibly understood what his brother was telling him. So he probably he could have made a judgment call in the sense like, oh, he's probably just pumping him up and whatnot. But like, if he could have understood what he was saying, I think that there's a chance that he could have labeled that as coaching. And especially because Guga wasn't known at that point. He wasn't a French Open lovely. He wasn't the people didn't necessarily like know Kuerten at all at that time. So it would have been easier to give him a warning rather. If it was, for example, if you were for Thomas, maybe not for Thomas Muster, because I heard that he wasn't necessarily that liked, but if you were for Nadal or Federer to get a warning, it would have been tougher. So, or a Frenchman. So, because they would go berserk on the stands and they would just be screaming loudly, and it would have been a tough decision. But for Guga, I think it would have been an easy take to be like, oh yeah, that's coaching, and just kind of like move on. So, interesting piece of tennis knowledge, I guess. Like that remains the question, the doubt. But in the end of the day, the call that was made was the right one, except for when the ball is out, and we know it was out. But that judgment call ended up being the one that gave him the boost. Well, not the boost, but like kind of like left the door open for him to just kind of like receive those words of encouragement and change the outcome of the match and just beat Muster in that final. And one of the reasons why I kind of like am talking much about this final, just kind of like came to me a bit, is that I really feel like that match defined a lot in Guga's mentality coming into the next matches that he played. That series of 3 matches is definitely like undoubtedly the ones that made him who he is, and drove him to win the tournament at the end of the 2 weeks. But he came up against Thomas Muster. Muster, as I mentioned, he was a solid clay player. He was the winner on clay. Some players were actually kind of critical of him because he won most of his stuff on clay, and some people called his rankings artificial because of that. But he did have some success on hard court as well. So, but in any case, I think winning against such a powerful player, such a name as Thomas Muster's, really gave him the boost to think, hey, I can do this. And coming back from that set, because he's not like Muster was like playing his worst. He didn't have the greatest season. Let's put it out there. He wasn't having the greatest season of all on 1997, but he was still Thomas Muster. He would still kind of steamroll over players that just kind of like let him have his way. And during that coaching part, during that encouragement part, one of the reasons why he kind of like received that is because he was showing and shouting, maybe in Portuguese as well, how he was thinking, what am I even doing here? Like, I just want to go home. Like, just get me out of this court. This is horrible. I hate this. So yeah, and that's why I feel like it's coaching, because he changed his mindset very like from A to B real quick. So yeah, I feel like this match is incredible for his career, and I think is one that should be remembered. The video that I saw was so sad because it was on ESPN, and I believe they were having issues with at Roland Garros. So like from the broadcast was not necessarily well, it was good broadcasting, obviously, but sometimes they have technical problems. And by 3-love in the 4th set, where for Thomas Muster, he won that 6-3. They just had an issue, and the transmission was not coming through. The broadcast was not coming over to ESPN, and apparently they had problems in the Roland Garros end. So I lost the final parts of the 4th set, and until like it was like 3-all in the, or 3-2, I believe, in the 5th set. So I just kind of like lost all of that. I couldn't really watch it, which is a little sad to me. But yeah, that's a thing that happened. And yeah, like, and for the other Roland Garros titles, obviously they were very important. The 1997 one, I think, I won't say it's the most important, but it's the most iconic because of all the players that he beat and his ranking and then his story coming to the tournament. But there was just another match that I just kind of like wanted to touch on before I start wrapping up this podcast, is how he played against the qualifier in 2001. Yeah, let me just double check that, but I'm pretty sure it was 2001. Yeah, so he played the fourth round against Michael Russell in 2001. Michael Russell being the American qualifier, who, as per his own words, he was coming onto the court believing, well, I just want to do my best to like not just go get out of here 6-love. And that boggles my mind a bit, like just kind of like a parenthesis in how Guga was viewed as a steamroller. He was a big player, man. Like sometimes it's hard for me to believe in that, being from Brazil and looking at players nowadays and just kind of like, man, Gustavo Kuerten was feared by players. He wasn't nobody. Well, he was number one, so it makes sense. But some number ones, you just kind of like get a feeling that players are less scared of than others. But Kuerten was feared, and even more so on clay. So that really makes me feel really happy about him and about because this is my idol, right? Michael Russell led by 2-6 as I said, and 5-3 in the third, and held a match point on serve, as I said early on. And when Kuerten finished that match, when he won, he finally put away the final smash, which, by the way, that match point is incredible because Michael Russell's defense is just insane. He just really could just run around the court very, very quickly. He slid really well. It was really surprising to me that he didn't become much better than that in his career, because he was a fantastic mover. He's a fantastic player. Maybe if he had won that match, things would have turned out differently for him. But he also said he's really happy about having this piece of history. And what a piece of history, because at the end of the match, as I was saying, Gustavo Kuerten just shook hands with Russell. I don't think he shook hands with the umpire before he did this, but he went back on the court and he picked up his racket and he drew a heart on the Roland Garros court, on Philippe Chatrier court. And that just kind of is one of the most iconic moments in his career as a tennis player, and in terms of his love for the Roland Garros crowd, for the French crowd. And people love him there. And skipping now all of the issues with his career prior to that, I just really want to remember him for his awesomeness as a world number one and his achievements. Because if you start looking too much as like when he did poorly and he started winning less titles and whatnot, it kind of seems for me to take away from how powerful and how complete his playing style was, and him as a player he was. So just jumping over fast forward to his final match, which he played at Roland Garros. He requested a wild card to play his final match at Roland Garros. He played on Philippe Chatrier in the first round against Paul-Henri Mathieu from France. And he was obviously granted that. Like, Roland Garros loves him. Like, he loves Roland Garros. It's a love story from start to finish. So he was obviously granted that, and he played his final match. He kind of like almost like an exhibition style, and the crowd loved being there. And Paul-Henri Mathieu kind of also really liked being there as well. He explained how he really didn't really feel like he was going to lose that, and explainably, Guga was not really moving quite as well as he used to. He hadn't had that much match experience, match fitness at that time. He was kind of like just going down slowly but surely. He was ranked outside the 1000s in the world. And so, yeah, there was just essentially no way that Mathieu would have lost that. But he did really make sure that that match wasn't just going to be really boring and terrible for people to watch. And he wasn't really just going to kind of like walking that fine line between like letting the guy have some fun and having some fun with him, and kind of have the moment be about him and not about Guga and not about Mathieu. But also doing his job as a tennis player and winning the match. So, but Guga, as always, just smiling from ear to ear, just pleasing the crowd, and the crowd behind him and behind Mathieu as well. It was just a good time. That match was just a good time. And I remember to this day, like, watching. I think I watched the second and third sets only, and his last shot ever on a professional court was a backhand slice, a backhand drop shot that hit the net, and that was it. that's how Gustavo Kuerten's career ended. And what an end. Like, I mean, it wasn't an end like Pete Sampras's win in the US Open, his Grand Slam title run. But it was an end in the sense that it was like a closing chapter. It wasn't an achievement chapter. It was literally a farewell. It was just good to be here, and it was nice to see you once more. And now I'm moving on to another thing. So without no pretension of believing that he could do it, kind of a little bit like Andre Agassi's final match. Maybe Andre Agassi was more fit than Guga was when he played his final match. But yeah, and really they honored him in the perfect way, in the best way possible in the first round. There's actually a quote that I want to read from Christopher Clary on the New York Times. He says, "Not many first round losers receive a prize, but then not many players burst into the light by winning their first Grand Slam title when they are ranked 66th in the world and then make the precipitous climb to the top." So what happens is that he received a cross section. He received a trophy which was the cross section of a clay court, and I believe from the courts at Roland Garros. And man, that's meaningful. I think there's a photo of him there, which is not loading for me right now, but it's just him like in tears, like raising his trophy. And it's not a trophy of like I win a tournament of an accomplishment. It's like a trophy of this is a beacon, this is a symbol of our relationship together, Roland Garros and me. It's kind of like I will always love you, and I will always look at this and remember it. And I remember you, and I remember the moments that I've been on the court. And honestly, it was an amazing sight. I really loved it. Like when I was doing my research and I was looking at all this, I definitely felt a little bit tearful. Like I felt like I wanted to cry a bit, but like of happiness and a little bit of sadness because he couldn't do more. But from what his career was and what he accomplished, the things that he did, how nice he was to everyone. Roger Federer, in an interview that he did with him recently for a fundraiser that Guga was putting up to make a relief fund for families in Brazil who are struggling during the lockdown period, during the coronavirus crisis. Roger Federer said, if Guga calls, I'm always there. I'm always there for him. And he said, you probably don't remember this, Federer saying to Guga in the interview, but you were always really nice to me, and that really like struck a chord on me and like really made a difference in the beginning of my career, of my professional career. And he said, you probably don't remember this because you were just nice to everyone. And it's just so true. I could be talking about Guga the person and forever and not even mention his tennis, but just mention how great of a person he is, how nice he is. And there's lots more that I left out, and I'm already reaching the 1 hour mark here. So yeah, if maybe dreaming really high here, but if I could one day make an interview with him, if I could ever meet him one day, like that would probably be my dream come true. And I'm a big fan of Novak Djokovic, but I think all time I am a bigger fan of Gustavo Kuerten, and I would put that in my top priority list. If I could meet one player, past or present, that would be Guga. If I could never meet another player again, I would still pick Guga. Other than I wouldn't pick Federer, I wouldn't pick Djokovic and Nadal. I would definitely pick Guga because he's just so influential for me and for my goals. Like when I think of myself, like trying to make a career in tennis, not necessarily a player. Well, obviously not a player, but even when I was a kid, like I kind of like I wanted to be like him. Even though, funny story, I didn't actually know that he had a one-handed backhand because I didn't watch him that much growing up. I just knew about him because he was a big sensation. I think I don't remember who said that. Guga mentioned in one interview that a football player said, in Brazil, there's soccer. Ayrton Senna, who's a Formula One driver who died in 1994. Fantastic pilot. I think that's what they call it, like a pilot, Formula One pilot, racer, and Gustavo Kuerten. So like those three sports pillars in Brazil. And there's just no way to not know him. And yeah, I really liked when people like would talk to me and say, oh yeah, you really look like Guga because of my hair and how skinny I am and whatnot. And that kind of like really makes me happy. But I didn't actually find out that he had a one-handed backhand until I was way too old to change my ways. Otherwise I would. But I was really surprised by that. And I don't know why I was surprised, because it's probably just growing up, just kind of like everybody learns the two-handed. And when you come and see a person that hits one-handed, it's kind of like, whoa, I never thought about it. But like, I guess in the 90s it was way more common than it is nowadays. But yeah, as I said, I can go on forever, but I don't have forever, and I don't want to be here forever either, because well, we all have a life to live outside of recording sessions. And I guess thanks for listening. And if you listen to this and you know Guga, let me know, because I really want to talk to him. And just as a final message, I would like to just call people to remember him for his good times. He's not dead, by the way. He's very much alive. As I said, like I want to meet him, but kind of like forget about like the hip problems, and just kind of appreciate people's and players' careers when they were at their best, and just have fun, and just kind of like being nice and lovely to everyone you meet. It's a really good lesson that you can take, and just also have confidence in yourself. Like I feel like this is all lessons that you can take from Gustavo Kuerten's career. And that's it for my time. And thanks so much for listening. Bye bye.